Tehran, Iran, a city where the air itself seems to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets, suspended in a permanent state of tension between its glorious past and its fortified present. As the sun dips below the Alborz Mountains, casting long, jagged shadows across the sprawling metropolis, a different kind of life begins to stir behind the high, concrete walls of the elite northern districts. Here, in the secluded villas of the Revolutionary Guard's upper echelon, power is not just exercised, it is celebrated with a decadent, almost defiant luxury. On this particular evening, the gates of a heavily guarded compound swing open for a series of black, armored sedans. Inside the villa, the atmosphere is thick with the scent of expensive Persian tobacco, the sweetness of Isfahan saffron, and the cold, sharp edge of geopolitical conspiracy. This is a gathering of the untouchables, the men who oversee the Islamic Republic's most sensitive military projects. They believe they are in a sanctuary, a place where their words are safe from the prying eyes of Western satellites and the digital ears of the NSA. They trust the walls. They trust the guards with their Kalashnikovs. And most dangerously of all, they trust the silence of the men who serve them. Moving with a quiet, practiced humility among these titans of the regime is a man who officially does not exist. He wears the crisp, white tunic of a formal server, his movements so fluid and unremarkable that he has effectively become part of the architecture. To the generals and scientists at the table, he is a non-entity, a pair of hands to pour tea, a shadow to clear a plate. They do not look at his eyes. They do not notice the slight calluses on his fingers that don't match his profession. They don't see the cold, analytical mind recording every syllable spoken in the room. He is an operative of the Mossad, and he has just achieved the impossible. He has breached the inner sanctum of the Ayatollah's military brain trust. This is the untold story of Operation Velvet Shadow. It is a chronicle of extreme patience, a masterclass in human intelligence that proves that in an era of drones and artificial intelligence, the most devastating weapon is still a human being who knows how to listen. Over the next hour, we will dissect every phase of this mission, from the brutal psychological conditioning of the agent to the heart-stopping moment at the banquet table where a single slip in etiquette could have triggered a public execution. This is not just a story of espionage. It is a deep dive into the absolute limit of human nerves. The intelligence landscape of the 21st century is often depicted as a digital battlefield, a realm of glowing screens, complex algorithms, and silent satellite flyovers. But for the Mossad, Israel's premier intelligence agency, there is a fundamental truth that technology has never been able to overwrite. The most vital secrets are not stored on servers. They are whispered in rooms. In the early 2010s, a shadow began to grow over the Zagros Mountains in western Iran. Intelligence reports, gathered from high-altitude reconnaissance and frantic whispers from defectors, suggested the construction of a facility that shouldn't exist. It was deep, carved into the ancient granite, designed to withstand the most powerful bunker-buster munitions in the Western arsenal. This was the Paran Project, a site so sensitive that its very name was a death sentence for anyone caught speaking it outside of authorized circles. The problem for Israeli intelligence was not the location. They knew exactly where the mountain had been hollowed out. The problem was the intent. Was this a site for uranium enrichment, or was it the final assembly point for a nuclear warhead? To answer this, the Mossad didn't need more photos from space. They needed a witness. They needed a seat at the table where the decisions were made. The target was defined: the private, informal dinner meetings of General Vahid's inner circle. Vahidi was a man forged in the fires of the Iran-Iraq War, a veteran of the Revolutionary Guard who had spent decades perfecting the art of survival. He was a master of counter-espionage, a man who treated every phone as a bug and every computer as a portal for the Mossad's Unit 8200 hackers. To Vahidi and his contemporaries, the only safe space was the traditional banquet. In the privacy of high-walled villas in the affluent Shamiran district of Tehran, these men felt they could speak freely. They gathered to eat cello kebab, drink tea, and discuss the fate of the Middle East. They were surrounded by layers of security, biometric scanners at the gates, signal jammers that turned cell phones into useless bricks, and elite guards who had been vetted for 3 generations. It was a fortress of flesh and stone. To any sane strategist, infiltrating such a circle was a suicide mission. Yet, the Mossad identified a psychological blind spot in the Iranian elite, a flaw born of the very class structure of the regime. The generals and the mullahs lived in a world of absolute hierarchy. In their eyes, the world was divided between the powerful who spoke and the invisible who served. A waiter, a cook, a driver. To the Iranian elite, these people were not human beings with agency. They were background noise. They were the furniture of the elite life. The Mossad realized that if they could place one of their own into that background noise, they wouldn't just be hacking a computer. They would be hacking the very heart of the regime's decision-making process. But the challenge was staggering. How do you find a man who can pass as a native Iranian, who understands the complex social nuances of the Tehran upper class, and who possesses the technical skills to record and transmit data from within a signal-jammed fortress? The agency began a global search within its ranks, looking for a rare breed of operative, the combatant, Loam. They needed someone who could disappear into a role for years, if necessary. They needed someone who could withstand the crushing loneliness of a deep cover assignment and the constant, suffocating fear of discovery. The selection process was not just about language or ethnicity. It was about the strength of the soul. They were looking for a man who could pour tea for his enemies while his own country was being threatened with annihilation, all without letting a single drop of liquid tremble on the saucer. The creation of a deep cover operative, or a Katsa, for a mission of this magnitude is not a matter of weeks, but a transformation that spans years. The Mossad's Mossad department, the wing responsible for special operations involving deep cover agents, understands that a disguise is not something you wear, it is something you become. For the operative we've identified as Farzad, the process began with the systematic destruction of his former life. Every photograph, every digital footprint, and every record of his existence in Israel was purged. He was moved to a safe house in a remote part of the Galilee, a region whose terrain and climate could, with enough imagination, mimic the outskirts of Tehran. Here, Farzad underwent a process of Persianization, so intense it bordered on psychological reprogramming. It wasn't enough to speak Farsi fluently. He had to master the social grammar of the Iranian people. He spent months studying the concept of tear-off, the intricate, often exhausting system of Iranian etiquette that governs everything from how you greet a superior to how you refuse a second helping of food. To the Western mind, tear-off is a polite formality. To a spy in Tehran, a failure to navigate its nuances is a flashing neon sign that says outsider. Farzad practiced for hours with simulated Iranian families, learning the subtle art of the servant's bow, not too low to seem suspicious, but low enough to signal a lack of ambition. But the physical training was even more specialized. The Mossad recruited master chefs and formal stewards who had once served in the court of the Shah before the 1979 revolution. These aging men, living in exile, taught Farzad the dance of the silver tray. He learned that in a high-society Persian banquet, the way a waiter holds a crystal glass or the specific sequence in which he serves the tadig, the prized crispy rice, communicates his entire history. If he served the youngest general before the senior cleric, the dinner would stop, and questions would be asked. Farzad practiced carrying heavy trays laden with water-filled carafes across uneven surfaces while wearing a blindfold, training his inner ear to maintain perfect balance even under extreme stress. He had to learn to move like water, omnipresent but unnoticed. Simultaneously, the agency's technical division, known as Nehemiah, was engineering the tools of his trade. Because the targets used advanced electronic countermeasures, including white noise generators and nonlinear junction detectors, NLJD, which can find electronics even when turned off, traditional spying equipment was useless. They had to go pre-electronic and submolecular. They developed a series of sensors made from biocompatible polymers that mimicked the organic structure of silk and cotton. These sensors were woven into the very threads of Farzad's formal waiter's vest. One button was actually a high-gain acoustic sensor that used the fabric of the vest as a diaphragm to pick up vibrations from voices across the room. Another was a micro camera that used a liquid crystal lens, capable of changing focus based on the heat signature of a document. The most difficult part of the architecture, however, was the backstop. To get Farzad into a high-level catering company in Tehran, the Mossad had to manipulate the Iranian labor market. They spent 2 years quietly acquiring a small, struggling produce supply chain in Turkey that exported specialized herbs to Iran. Through this chain, they funneled Farzad into the Iranian capital. He didn't arrive as a spy. He arrived as a humble migrant worker from the provinces, a man with calloused hands and a quiet disposition who was willing to work 18 hours a day for half the wages of a city dweller. He spent a full year working in the damp, dark basements of Tehran's wholesale markets, smelling of onions and diesel, just to establish the stench of a real worker. The Mossad knew that the Revolutionary Guard investigators wouldn't just check his papers. They would check his soul. They needed to find a man who looked like he had been defeated by life. They needed to find a man who was so unremarkable that he was invisible. As we look at the immense resources spent just to train one man for one night, I have to ask you, do you think this level of dedication is still common in today's world of instant results? Does the patience of the Mossad fascinate you as much as it does us? Share your thoughts on the long game of espionage in the comments. The transition from the simulated environments of the Negev to the gritty, smog-choked reality of Tehran was a sensory shock that no amount of training could fully prepare Farzad to endure. Tehran is a city of layers, a chaotic surface of traffic and commerce that hides a subterranean world of fear, suspicion, and absolute power. Farzad's insertion was not a dramatic leap from a plane, but a slow, agonizing crawl through the city's social strata. He lived in a cramped, shared apartment in the south of the city, where the smell of open sewers and cheap gasoline permeated every fabric of his life. For months, he played the part of the provincial migrant, working in the Bazar-e Bozorg, the Grand Bazaar, hauling heavy sacks of spices and rice until his back ached and his hands were permanently stained with the dust of commerce. This period of hibernation was essential. The Mossad's Unit 8200 monitored the Iranian internal security frequencies, watching for any sign that a new arrival had triggered a red flag. They knew that the Pastoran, the Revolutionary Guard, maintained a vast network of neighborhood informants. Farzad had to be seen by his neighbors as a man of routine, a quiet, pious worker who went to the mosque, ate his simple meal of bread and feta, and never asked questions. He was a man with no history. And in the eyes of the state, a man with no history is a man who doesn't exist. The opportunity to move toward the target came through a meticulously planned accident. The Mossad had identified Zafran Catering, the premier agency used by the Iranian Ministry of Defense for its private functions. The owner of the company was a man named Mahmoud, a veteran of the bureaucracy who prided himself on the purity of his staff. Through a series of shadow transactions in Dubai, the Mossad's financial operatives managed to place Mahmoud in a significant debt. They didn't threaten him. Instead, they offered him a solution in the form of a highly recommended worker from the provinces, Farzad. Working at Zafran Catering was like entering a high-security prison. Every morning, Farzad and the other servers were searched. They were stripped of their personal belongings and forced to wear uniforms provided by the company. Uniforms that were laundered and inspected by government security officers. This was the first major hurdle for Mossad's technical team. How could they get Farzad's recording equipment through a strip search? The answer lay in the Nehemiah department's mastery of material science. They didn't give Farzad a device to carry. They integrated the technology into his body's routine. During his training, Farzad had undergone a minor, seemingly routine dental procedure. In reality, one of his molars had been replaced with a sophisticated bone conduction transducer. By biting down in a specific pattern, he could activate a subdermal recording system that used the calcium in his own skeletal structure as an antenna. But for the Banquet, they needed more. They needed visual data and high-fidelity audio. The solution was the thread. The Mossad had developed a conductive polymer that looked and felt exactly like high-quality silk thread. During a night shift at the catering warehouse, Farzad, using a needle hidden in his sleeve, expertly replaced the decorative stitching on his formal waistcoat with this smart thread. Every stitch was a component. The entire garment had become a massive, flexible circuit board, invisible to the naked eye and transparent to the magnetic scanners of the guard. As the day of the secret banquet approached, the atmosphere in the kitchen became electric. The Revolutionary Guard security teams arrived to vet the staff one last time. They sat Farzad down in a cold, fluorescent-lit room. An officer with a face like scarred leather stared at him for an hour, asking about his village, his parents, his prayers. Farzad didn't rely on a script. He relied on the void he had created in his own mind. He answered with the slow, dull cadence of a man who had no ambitions beyond his next paycheck. The officer eventually stood up, spat on the floor, and cleared him. Farzad was in. He was now a trusted ghost, authorized to enter the Saadabad Palace, the very heart of the regime's darkness. I want to pause here and ask you, can you imagine the sheer weight of that silence? Sitting in an interrogation room, knowing that a single heartbeat out of rhythm could lead to your disappearance? Do you believe a person can truly erase their soul to survive such a moment? Let us know in the comments if you think Farzad's psychological endurance is the most impressive part of this mission. Before we proceed to the heart-stopping events of the banquet, I want to express my deepest gratitude for your continued attention. We are building a narrative that honors the complexity of these operations, and your engagement is what drives this channel forward. The next chapter will take us inside the palace walls, where the stakes reach their ultimate limit. The Saadabad Palace Complex, once the residence of the Qajar and Pahlavi dynasties, sits in the foothills of the Alborz Mountains like a sleeping stone beast. On the night of the operation, the air was unusually crisp, smelling of pine needles and the ozone of an approaching storm. As the Zafran catering van passed through the triple-layered security cordons, Farzad watched through the darkened windows as the SEPA guards, armed with Heckler and Coke MP5S, conducted a final sweep with mirrors and drug-sniffing dogs. This was the moment where the smart thread in his vest faced its ultimate test. If the guards had deployed a nonlinear junction detector, a device capable of sensing the semiconductor junctions in a circuit, Farzad would have been dragged from the van before he ever touched the palace floor. But the Mossad's gamble held. The guard were looking for bombs and transmitters, not the molecular structure of a silk waistcoat. Inside the banquet hall, the sheer scale of the decadence was a slap in the face to the revolutionary ideals the regime claimed to uphold. The walls were adorned with silk tapestries from Yazd, and the floor was covered in a single, massive Isfahan carpet that had taken 20 years to weave. The table was a monolithic slab of black obsidian, set for 12. This was not a public event. It was a gathering of the deep state, the architects of Iran's nuclear and missile programs. Among them was the director of the secret enrichment site at Fordow and a high-ranking military advisor to the supreme leader. These were men whose faces were rarely seen on television, yet their signatures dictated the movement of billions of dollars. Farzad's role was the second-team man. In the hierarchy of Persian service, this is a position of total invisibility. He was responsible for circulating behind the guests, ensuring that the samovar, the traditional tea urn, never ran dry and that the small glass cups, known as estikins, were always filled to exactly 2/3 capacity to allow for the proper aroma to escape. He moved with a gait he called the ghost walk, a technique where the weight is shifted to the balls of the feet to eliminate the sound of footsteps on the marble floor. As the first course of Kashki Bejamjan was served, the conversation at the table began to sharpen. The guests, lulled into a sense of absolute security by the jammers and the armed guards at the door, began to speak with terrifying clarity. They discussed the red line protocols, the exact number of centrifuges required to reach breakout capacity before the next round of UN inspections. Farzad leaned in to clear a plate, his smart buttons positioned just inches from the mouth of the nuclear director. He wasn't just hearing words. He was capturing the subtle inflections of stress and confidence in their voices, data that Mossad's behavioral analysts would later use to map the psychological state of the Iranian leadership. Then, the air in the room suddenly froze. General Vahidi, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his legendary paranoia, stopped eating. He laid his silver fork down with a sharp clack that echoed against the obsidian table. He turned his torso slowly, his eyes dark, cold, and searching, locking onto Farzad. The general had a sixth sense for anomalies, a trait that had saved him from 3 assassination attempts in the past. "You," Vahidi said, his voice a low, raspy growl. "You handle that picture like a man who has held a rifle." The silence that followed was absolute. The other guests stopped talking. The head of security at the door shifted his stance, his hand moving closer to his holster. In that microsecond, Farzad's brain went into a state of hyperprocessing. His training told him that any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the eyes, would be his death warrant. He didn't look down. He didn't look the general in the eye. Instead, he adopted the half-gaze of the servant, looking at the general's chin. "My village in the south, Excellency," Farzad replied, his voice a masterpiece of dull, provincial monotone, "was taken by the Iraqis when I was a boy. I carried water for the Basij volunteers before I was old enough to shave. My hands were shaped by the weight of buckets long, before they were shaped by the weight of silver. I apologize if my movements lack the grace of the city." It was a perfect response. It touched on the sacred defense, the war with Iraq, which was the emotional core of the regime's identity. It framed his stiffness not as military training, but as the lingering scars of childhood spent in the service of the revolution. Vahidi stared at him for what felt like an eternity, his eyes searching for a crack in the facade. Finally, the general gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "The South breeds hard men," he muttered, picking up his fork. "Pour the tea, and make it hot." Farzad bowed, his hands as steady as the granite of the Zagros Mountains, and poured the tea. But inside, his nervous system was screaming. He had just looked in the mouth of the tiger and survived. As he retreated into the shadows of the pantry, he knew that the smart thread had captured the most vital part of the evening. The general had just confirmed, in a moment of frustration, the exact coordinates of a secret storage facility for yellow cake, uranium that Western intelligence had been hunting for a decade. The mission was no longer about survival. It was about getting that data across the border. I want to stop here and ask you, if you were in Farzad's shoes, standing in that room, could you have maintained that calm? Or would the sheer weight of the general's gaze have broken you? This is the difference between a spy and a legend. Tell us in the comments what you think is the most terrifying part of being invisible. We are approaching the end of this journey. The data has been gathered, the tiger has been faced, but the hardest part is yet to come, the escape. In our final chapter, we will witness the silent extraction that left the Iranian regime chasing shadows for years. Stay with us for the climax of Operation Velvet Shadow. The true genius of a Mossad operation lies not in the infiltration, but in the vanishing. As the banquet reached its conclusion at 2:30 a.m., the air in the Sadabad palace was thick with the exhaustion of powerful men and the lingering residue of heavy spices. Farzad did not rush. He knew that the Revolutionary Guard's security protocols were at their most sensitive during the exit phase. He helped the other servers stack the obsidian-colored plates. His movements remained rhythmic and dull, maintaining the persona of the exhausted provincial worker until the very last crate was loaded into the Zafran catering van. As the van cleared the final palace gate, Farzad felt the smart thread in his vest vibrating almost imperceptibly, a signal from the remote listening post that the data transmission was 100% complete. He had done it. He had stood inches away from the architects of a nuclear shadow and stolen their blueprints. But his mission was only half over. In a world of deep cover espionage, the moment you have what you came for is the moment you are most vulnerable. Instead of returning to the catering headquarters, Farzad executed a cold break. He asked the driver to drop him off at a crowded bus terminal, claiming he needed to visit a sick relative in the south. The moment the van's taillights disappeared into the Tehran smog, Farzad entered a public restroom. In less than 60 seconds, he stripped off the formal waiter's uniform, the garment that held enough technology to start a war, and stuffed it into a hidden compartment behind a loose ventilation grate. He emerged wearing the grease-stained overalls of a municipal mechanic. For the next 48 hours, Farzad became a ghost in his own shadow. He traveled not by plane or car, but through the subterranean artery, a network of safe houses and stay-behind agents of the Mossad had spent decades building within Iran. He moved through the crowded Share markets, slept in the back of trucks carrying pomegranates, and never stayed in one place for more than 4 hours. He used dead letter drops to signal his progress, never once using a digital device. He was walking back to the world of the living, but he had to do it as a dead man. The extraction point was the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Zagros Mountains, near the border with Turkey. Here, the Kaidan, the Mossad's elite action unit, was waiting. As he crossed the invisible line in the dirt under the cover of a moonless night, Farzad didn't look back. He didn't feel triumph. He felt an overwhelming, hollow exhaustion. He'd spent years being Farzad, and now that man had to be executed so that the operative could return home. The aftermath in Tehran was a storm of silent fury. 3 weeks after the banquet, the Iranian Internal Security Agency, the VAIA, realized something was wrong. A series of precision cyber-physical attacks had suddenly paralyzed the very centrifuges the general had discussed at the dinner. The blueprints they thought were secure had been used to create a digital Stuxnet-style twin of their system, which was then destroyed from within. The VAIA arrested the owner of Zafran Catering, the manager, and every server who had been in the room. They searched for Farzad, but they found only a void. The records of his village were gone. The cousin who recommended him had vanished. Even the DNA samples they collected from his rented room matched no one in their database. It was as if a ghost had served them tea and then evaporated into the Persian mist. To this day, the men who sat at that table in the Saadabad Palace wonder how their secrets were compromised. They blame their computers, their generals, and their satellites. They never suspected that the answer was standing right behind them, holding a silver tray. Farzad returned to Israel, but he could never truly go back to who he was. The price of such a mission is the permanent loss of the self. He lives today under a third identity, a man who walks among us in silence, knowing that he once held the fuse of a global explosion in his hands and blew it out with a single, humble bow. We have reached the end of Operation Velvet Shadow, but the world of shadows never truly sleeps. If you found this journey through the limits of human nerves and the secrets of the Mossad worth your time, please leave a shadow in the comments below. It tells us you've stayed until the very end, and it helps us continue to bring these high-stakes narratives to light. The operation we have just dissected, the infiltration of a waiter into the heart of the Iranian regime, stands as a stark testament to a truth often forgotten in our digital age. Technology can fail, signals can be jammed, and satellites can be blinded. But the human element is a variable that no machine can truly calculate. Farzad did not just steal data, he stole the sense of security from an entire regime. He proved that even in a fortress of marble and steel, the most dangerous opening is the one created by human arrogance. The simple, fatal mistake of looking at another human being and seeing only a servant. For the Mossad, this was a strategic victory of the highest order. It delayed a nuclear program, exposed clandestine networks, and forced an enemy to look inward with suspicion, tearing itself apart in search of a mole that had already vanished. But for the operative, the victory is more complex. To survive at that table, he had to give up his own identity, his own peace of mind, and his very soul. He is the silent sentinel of a world we only see in flashes of news reports and redacted documents. If this exploration into the razor edge of espionage, the psychology of deep cover, and the high-stakes chess game of the Middle East has captivated you, I invite you to join our inner circle. Click the subscribe button and activate all notifications. By doing so, You ensure that you're always the first to be notified when we declassify the next great operation of modern intelligence. Your engagement, your likes, your shares, and your presence is the fuel that allows us to produce these deep dives with the rigor they deserve. And now, I leave you with one final thought to discuss in the comments below. In an era where drones can strike from miles away and AI can crack any code, is the human ghost, the spy who hides in plain sight, still the most powerful weapon on Earth? Or was Operation Velvet Shadow the last of a dying breed? We look forward to reading your insights. Thank you for your loyalty to this channel and for seeking the truth behind the headlines. Until the next investigation, stay vigilant.